Why was a Navy SEAL staring at a woman mopping the armory floor? The question rippled quietly through the room, though no one dared speak it out loud. The industrial lights hummed above, their pale glow spilling across waxed concrete that reflected shadows of rifles, boots, and hurried bodies. Marines were bustling through the corridors, checking lists, handling gear, preparing for the day's combined training exercise. But in the middle of that storm of activity, a young woman bent quietly over her mop, shoulders steady, motions calm. Corporal Riley Montgomery moved like someone who belonged and didn't belong all at once. Her uniform was clean but plain, stripped of the combat patches that once told stories of fire and survival. Her auburn hair was tucked into a tight regulation bun. She looked ordinary, almost invisible, just another maintenance worker handling her shift before the afternoon rush. Most people glanced at her once, then dismissed her. A mop in her hands defined her in their eyes. But Marcus Chen, chief petty officer of the SEAL team stationed there, wasn't so quick to dismiss. His eyes followed the rhythm of her movements. Something about the precision of the way she moved, deliberate, practiced, economical, unsettled him. It was the way someone handled themselves when every action once mattered in life or death. And yet here she was, reduced to cleaning floors no one noticed. She felt the weight of stares sometimes, though not in this moment. Riley was focused on finishing the day's job before the sun shifted high and heat filled the armory. She always came early, alone with the long hallways, the smell of gun oil and dust, the echo of her mop bucket wheels. If she was quick, she could clear most of the corridors before the chatter of Marines made her invisible again. Invisible, that word clung to her. She had once been anything but invisible. The sound of boots behind her didn't make her flinch, but inside she felt a little ripple of irritation. They'd walk past without acknowledgement, as if she were part of the furniture. The same had happened yesterday. The same the day before. In her pocket, folded small, was the one reminder that her story wasn't so simple, a Purple Heart citation, paper softened by weeks of being carried like a secret she couldn't put down. She sometimes touched it with her fingertips when no one was looking, a reminder that her past was real, even if no one here believed it. But today something was different. At the supply counter, Sergeant Davis leaned over a stack of forms, his face fixed in its usual scowl. He hadn't noticed her yet, but she already knew what was coming. He always had a comment, always something cutting to remind her she didn't fit the image of the Marine he respected. The thought made her throat tighten. Still, Riley pressed forward, one mop stroke after another. No one in the room knew she had once crawled through a kill zone with bullets tearing the earth beside her. No one here knew she had dragged men twice her size across dust and blood while her own shoulder burned from shrapnel. No one here knew she had heard their screams, their pleas, and refused to stop until they were breathing safe again. Here, she was just the girl with the mop. She tightened her grip on the wooden handle, her knuckles pale. She could feel the echoes of the battlefield in the back of her chest, memories she tried to bury but that always lingered. The heat of Afghanistan, the metallic taste of fear, the silence after explosions when the world seemed to hold its breath. She exhaled slowly, forcing her body back into the present. This wasn't the desert. This was Camp Lon, a safe place, a base, and yet her heart sometimes raced as if she was still there, still waiting for the next blast. The mop slid across the floor, leaving a dull shine in its wake. Around her, Marines talked in clusters, voices sharp, confident. She knew some of them had heard rumors of her past, whispers about a Bronze Star and lives saved under fire. But rumors never mattered. Not when Sergeant Davis sneered loud enough for everyone to hear. Not when others turned away, too busy or too unwilling to defend her. What mattered here wasn't the war she had fought. It was the job she did now. She hated how much that stung. The SEAL was still watching. She didn't look at him directly, but she felt his eyes. He wasn't sneering. He wasn't pitying either. Just watching as though piecing together a puzzle no one else cared to solve. For a moment, Riley wished he would stop. The last thing she wanted was another witness when Davis decided to tear her down again. She finished her section of the hallway and wrung out the mop, water dripping, echoing faintly in the cavernous armory. The smell of detergent mingled with gunmetal. She pulled the requisition slip from her pocket, smoothed it on her knee, and glanced toward the counter. She had filled out the same form dozens of times, supplies for cleaning, nothing more. A formality, a routine. But today, even before she slid it forward, she knew it wouldn't go smoothly. Something inside her tightened, a quiet dread she couldn't shake. It wasn't the paperwork. It wasn't even Davis. It was the way silence pooled around her when she entered spaces like this, the way conversations faltered for just a second, as though people didn't know what to do with her. Was she one of them, or wasn't she? She hated that question. Davis looked up. His eyes met hers with that familiar spark of disdain. Riley stood straight, her voice calm, steady, professional. She'd learned to bury the tremor years ago. She handed him the paper. For a moment he just stared. Then the corners of his mouth twisted. Riley felt her stomach knot, her body bracing for the blow she knew was coming. And across the room the SEAL's jaw tightened. He shifted his stance, weight settling into his feet. He didn't move yet, but something in him stirred, a decision unspoken. The room grew quieter, voices fading to the edges. Everyone was pretending not to watch, but they were. They always were. Riley's hand hovered near her pocket, fingertips brushing the folded citation like a talisman, a reminder she had faced worse. And yet, humiliation had a different weight than bullets. Davis leaned forward, his voice carrying far enough for everyone to hear. "Why don't you get a real Marine to sign this for you, sweetheart?" Her pulse pounded, her chest burned. The mop handle pressed against her palm, grounding her, reminding her who she was. She swallowed, lifted her chin, and spoke with quiet strength. "I am a Marine." The laughter that followed cut sharper than shrapnel. And the SEAL's hands curled into fists at his side. What kind of Marine carries a Purple Heart in her pocket and never shows it? The question haunted Riley even as Davis's laughter echoed through the armory. His mocking tone clung to the walls, sharper than steel scraping against concrete. Marines nearby pretended to busy themselves, rifling through papers, adjusting weapons. But their silence was deafening. Riley's eyes stayed fixed on Davis, calm on the outside, fire beneath the surface. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles whitened. For a moment she thought about pulling out the citation, shoving it in his face, making him read every word. Proof, undeniable proof of who she was. But her body refused. The paper stayed where it had been all morning, folded small, worn thin, tucked against her heart like a secret. What would it change anyway? People like Davis didn't see the battlefield when they looked at her. They saw the mop, the quiet figure in the corner, a woman out of place. Her mind slipped, unbidden, back to Afghanistan, back to the day her world had fractured into fire and blood. The convoy had been crawling along a dusty road outside Helmand Province when the blast tore through the second Humvee. The sound wasn't just loud, it was consuming, a roar that swallowed the air and spat out chaos. Riley remembered the shockwave lifting her off the ground, her ears ringing, her lungs seizing. The world slowed into fragments of dust, screams, and the metallic tang of blood. She had crawled forward on instinct, her body already moving before her mind caught up. Marines lay sprawled in the dirt, some motionless, some crying out. Gunfire cracked from the hillsides, enemy silhouettes cutting against the horizon. Her shoulder burned, her ribs stung, but none of it mattered. She went back once, dragged a man whose leg was gone below the knee. She went back twice, pulled another with a chest wound that left her hand slick with red. The third time, bullets snapped the ground inches from her cheek, kicking up dirt that stung her eyes. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. By the time she pulled the fourth Marine behind the wreckage, her vision swam and her body shook. 47 minutes. That's how long it lasted. long enough for her to be changed forever. She had been decorated after that, a bronze star, a purple heart. The citations spoke of courage, of sacrifice, of valor, but what they didn't capture was the silence that followed. The way the nights stretched long when sleep refused to come. The way she felt small in rooms where no one knew. Those medals now lived in a drawer she almost never opened, except the Purple Heart citation. That one she carried, because sometimes she needed to remind herself it wasn't a dream. And now, as Davis sneered down at her, she touched it again. The edges of the paper pressed against her fingertips, a reminder she had already proven herself. She shouldn't need to again. But humiliation has its own kind of battlefield. The seal across the room still hadn't moved. His jaw was locked, his gaze fixed. His team had gone silent too, picking up on his tension. Marcus Chen wasn't the kind of man who wasted words. He had seen arrogance before. He had seen cruelty. But what struck him now wasn't just Davis's words, it was Riley's silence. She didn't lash out, didn't argue. She just stood there steady, while her dignity was stripped piece by piece in front of an entire room of Marines. Chen thought of the young operators he had served with, men who cracked under less weight than this. He thought of the women he'd met in the field, quiet professionals who carried themselves with the same restraint Riley was showing now. And he thought, there's more to her than they see. Riley swallowed hard. She could feel the heat rising in her face, the sting in her throat. But she wouldn't cry, not here, not for Davis. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smug grin curling at his lips. Maybe you'd be better off in the laundry, Montgomery, or the chow hall. Mopping floors suits you. The words landed like blows. Riley's chest tightened, the memory of Afghanistan surging again. Back then, no one questioned her. Back then, courage was measured in actions, not appearances. Back then, she had been a Marine among Marines. Now, she was a joke in the eyes of a supply clerk who had never tasted combat. Her breath caught. She wanted to scream, to shout, to make them all see her. But another voice whispered inside, the voice that had kept her alive in Afghanistan. Don't waste energy on what doesn't matter. Focus. Endure. Finish the mission. But what was the mission now? The silence of the room was unbearable. She could feel every set of eyes on her, pretending not to watch but watching anyway. Some of them knew. Some had heard. The story of the medic who crawled through fire to save 4 men had passed in hushed tones months ago, but whispers weren't enough to save her now. Her pulse raced. Her vision blurred for a second. She blinked hard, steadying herself. Davis's grin widened. He thought he'd won. But something shifted. Riley straightened. Her voice was low, almost quiet, but it carried. I'm not here to prove myself to you, Sergeant. The room stilled. Her words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The calm in her tone was heavier than shouting. For a heartbeat, Davis faltered, thrown off balance. But then his sneer returned. That's right, he said. You don't need to prove yourself because you never were one of us. The line crossed something in her. It was more than disrespect. It was erasure. As if the battlefield she carried inside had never happened. As if the Marines she'd saved had never lived. The SEAL's eyes darkened. His hand flexed once, then steadied. He had seen enough. But Riley, she didn't move, didn't speak. She stood still, her heart pounding, the Purple Heart pressing against her ribs like a brand. Inside, though, something cracked. Not a breakdown, not surrender, something quieter, a decision forming. She wasn't invisible, not really, not anymore. What's worse than being insulted? Being insulted while everyone else stays silent. The air in the armory had grown heavy, as if the concrete walls themselves were listening. The clatter of equipment, the scratch of pens, the shuffle of boots, all of it seemed to fade, replaced by a silence thick with unspoken judgment. Riley stood at the counter, form still resting between her and Davis, though his hand hovered above it with deliberate disdain. He didn't just want to deny her, he wanted to humiliate her. Riley had felt humiliation before. She felt it in small doses, brushed off in meetings, overlooked in training rotations, spoken to as if she were furniture rather than flesh. But today was different. Today his words struck harder, cutting into the thin line she had drawn between her past and her present. "You think that mop makes you a Marine," Davis said. His laugh was sharp, cruel. "No, it makes you what you are, a mistake someone stamped with the eagle, globe, and anchor." The sound of laughter echoed again, though it came from no one else. Just him. The others stayed silent, their eyes averted. Silence could feel like complicity. Riley swallowed the burn rising in her throat. She would not cry. She would not give him that. Her hand twitched toward her pocket again, brushing the folded purple heart citation. She could have pulled it out, could have laid it flat on the counter, could have forced every set of eyes in that room to read the truth. But her body refused, not because she was ashamed, but because part of her believed it shouldn't be necessary. Courage shouldn't need validation. Still, each second stretched longer, the silence growing unbearable. And then Davis moved. With exaggerated slowness, he lifted the requisition form, the simple piece of paper Riley had filled out to request cleaning supplies, and tore it in half. The sound was sharp, final. He tore it again, and again, until the scraps fluttered to the ground like snow. The pieces scattered at Riley's boots. A small sound rippled from the Marines nearby, not words, not objections, just shifting feet, uneasy coughs. They knew it had gone too far, but still no one spoke. Riley's fists tightened at her sides, so hard her knuckles ached. She wanted to bend down, collect the pieces, tape them back together just to show she wouldn't be broken. But her body stayed rooted, heavy with shame. She thought of Afghanistan again. Not the blast, not the chaos. The silence afterward. The moments when she sat alone in the dark, listening to her heart hammer in her chest, wondering if she would ever feel normal again. That silence had been suffocating. This one was worse. Because here silence wasn't survival, it was betrayal. Her eyes lifted, scanning the room. Dozens of Marines, men she had once bled for, faces she might have saved if fate had placed them in her convoy years ago. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They just turned away, letting her carry the weight alone. She wanted to shout at them, wanted to rip open her chest and show them the scars, the stitches, the wounds they couldn't see. She wanted to scream, "I was there, I saved them, I saved us, I'm one of you." But her voice stuck in her throat, a lump of fire she couldn't swallow. Davis leaned closer, his words low but venomous enough to carry. "Find yourself a new line of work, Montgomery. Maybe one that actually fits your skill set. Laundry, food service, something useful." The connotation was clear, crude, deliberately cutting. And that was when something shifted in the room. For months, Riley had endured. She had stayed silent. She had swallowed insults, brushed them aside, told herself they didn't matter. But this was different, because this wasn't just about her. This was about every Marine who had ever been dismissed, disrespected, or silenced. Her eyes burned, tears threatening to rise, but she held them back with sheer force. She had cried enough alone. She would not break here. The silence was suffocating, until it was. The seal moved. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Chen stepped forward, slow but deliberate, each stride cutting through the stillness. His boots struck the floor with quiet authority, and the sound carried louder than any shout. The crowd parted almost instinctively, Marines shifting out of his way without a word. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with something harder. He had seen men die. He had seen arrogance destroy units, missions, lives. He knew the cost of disrespect, and what he had just witnessed was unacceptable. Riley's breath caught when she saw him approach. She didn't know what he would say, didn't know if he was about to make it worse. But something in the way he carried himself, steady, unshaken, made her chest loosen, if only slightly. Chen didn't look at her at first. He bent down, gathering the torn scraps of paper from the floor one by one. The gesture was small, quiet, but in military culture, gestures meant everything. Picking up her torn requisition form wasn't just about paper, it was about dignity, about respect. Davis's smirk faltered. He opened his mouth to speak, but Chen's gaze snapped up, icy and sharp, silencing him before a word escaped. The SEAL's voice was low, steady, but it carried to every corner of the armory. You just tore up a requisition from a Marine who's bled more for this country than you ever will. The words hit like a round through glass. Every head turned. Eyes darted between Riley, Davis, and Chen. Chen continued, his tone like a briefing, precise, measured, undeniable. Corporal Riley Montgomery, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Medic, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. She crawled through open fire and saved 4 lives after an IED blast, took shrapnel to the shoulder, a bullet to the ribs, and kept going. The room froze. Some Marines' faces shifted, recognition dawning. They had heard whispers, stories, but now those whispers were confirmed, spoken aloud by a SEAL whose word carried weight. Riley's chest tightened. She wanted to shrink back, wanted to disappear. She hadn't asked for this. But at the same time, something deep inside, something buried for too long, flickered to life. Validation, not pity, not sympathy, truth. Chen's words cut deeper still. You've done more in 47 minutes under fire than most men will in a lifetime. And you stand here mopping floors because of scars none of us can see. And he, Chen turned his glare on Davis, thinks that makes you less of a Marine. The silence that followed was different now, heavy still but charged, shifting. Davis's face drained of color. For the first time he looked unsure. His arrogance faltered beneath the weight of Chen's words. And Riley, she stood straighter. Her heart pounded, her hands trembled, but she didn't move. Because for the first time in months, she wasn't invisible. What would make a Navy SEAL hand over his rifle? That was the question every Marine in the armory asked themselves as Marcus Chen's words cut the silence to pieces. His voice had been steady, his facts irrefutable. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, 4 lives saved under fire. Riley Montgomery was no janitor, no mistake, no joke. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The scraps of paper in Chen's hand were trembling slightly, though his face betrayed nothing. Riley stood rigid, pulse racing, her cheeks burning as if the weight of every eye in the room was pressing against her skin. She had not wanted this, not like this, but she could not deny the flicker of relief that someone, anyone, had finally spoken the truth aloud. And then Chen did something no one expected. Slowly, deliberately, he slung the rifle from his shoulder. The weapon gleamed faintly under the fluorescent light, black steel polished from use. Every Marine watching knew the weight of that rifle, not just its physical heft, but its meaning. A rifle was more than a tool. It was identity, responsibility, trust. In military culture, you did not hand over your weapon, not to a stranger, not to anyone, unless the moment demanded it. Chen held it by the barrel, stepping toward Riley with calm, unshakable authority. Each footstep echoed in the armory, steady and unhurried. Marines shifted back instinctively, as though making room for something sacred. Riley's breath caught. Her eyes locked on the rifle, then on Chen's face. She didn't understand, not yet. When he reached her, he spoke softly. No theatrics, just words heavy with conviction. A warrior of your caliber deserves to carry a weapon, not a mop. He extended the rifle to her. Gasps rippled through the armory. No one had ever seen anything like it. A SEAL, a combat veteran of 4 deployments, willingly disarming himself in front of an entire room, handing his rifle, his lifeline, to a Marine others had dismissed as nothing more than a janitor. The symbolism was undeniable, immediate. Every tradition, every unspoken rule, every ounce of pride bound into military culture made that gesture monumental. To carry another warrior's weapon was to be recognized, to be trusted, to be honored. Riley stared at the rifle as though it were a live flame. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the surge of emotion rising inside her chest. She remembered the weight of her own rifle in Afghanistan, the way it had steadied her hands when the world erupted around her. She remembered how it felt to grip cold steel while dragging wounded men through blood and dust. That weapon had been more than protection. It had been a reminder she wasn't powerless. Now, after months of silence, she felt that power return. Her hand lifted slowly, hesitating. She didn't want to take it, didn't want to appear as though she was grasping at symbols. But Chen's eyes, calm, unwavering, left no room for doubt. He was offering her dignity, and dignity was not something you refused. Her fingers closed around the rifle. The weight hit her arms like a surge of memory. She felt every deployment, every night under foreign stars, every moment she had questioned whether she would make it home. The tremor in her hands wasn't weakness. It was recognition. For a moment, she could not breathe. The room was silent, stunned, shamed. Davis stood pale behind the counter, his mouth slightly open, pride deflating by the second. He tried to speak, but no words came. He had been exposed, stripped of his authority not by shouting, not by violence, but by the quiet truth of a single act. Riley's eyes lifted to Chen. For the first time since Afghanistan, she felt seen, truly seen. Not as a cleaner, not as a burden, but as what she had always been, a Marine. Her throat tightened. She wanted to thank him, to tell him what it meant, but words felt too small. Chen turned, his voice carrying once more. Not loud, just firm. Every man and woman in this room should remember what you just witnessed. This Marine bled for you before you even knew her name. You don't have to see the scars to respect them. You don't have to know the story to honor it. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. But if you stay silent while one of your own is torn down, you are complicit, and that silence dishonors us all. The weight of his words pressed heavy on every Marine in the room. Some lowered their eyes. Some shifted uncomfortably, shame burning in their faces. A few finally stepped forward, offering quiet apologies to Riley, voices low, words stumbling. It was too late to erase what had happened, but not too late to acknowledge it. Riley clutched the rifle close, not as possession but as proof. Proof that she wasn't invisible. Proof that someone had remembered. Her mind flickered back to the battlefield again. The blood, the screams, the dust. She thought of the 4 Marines she had pulled from death's grip, men who had gone home to their families because she hadn't given up. In those moments, she hadn't thought of medals, recognition, or even survival. She had thought only of finishing the mission. Now, standing in the armory with Chen's rifle in her hands, she realized this was another kind of mission. One she hadn't chosen, but one she couldn't ignore. She wasn't just carrying steel. She was carrying every silent Marine who had ever been overlooked, every wounded warrior dismissed because scars didn't show, every veteran whose story was buried under assumptions. And for the first time since the explosion in Helmand, she felt the burn of hope. The silence of the room lingered, but it had changed. No longer suffocating, no longer complicit. It was the silence of realization, of respect dawning where mockery once stood. Davis fumbled with another form, his hands shaking as he tried to regain some shred of dignity. But the balance had shifted. He wasn't the authority anymore. Not in this moment. Riley inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She didn't need to keep the rifle, didn't need to prove anything with it. But for the brief moment it rested in her hands, she felt whole again. Chen's eyes softened. He knew what this meant to her, and what it meant to everyone watching. Sometimes dignity didn't shout, it didn't demand, it simply acted. And the echo of that action would ripple far beyond the walls of the armory. How fast does news travel in a place where silence had once been the loudest sound? By the end of the day, what happened in the armory was already echoing across Camp Lon. It started in murmurs passed in the chow hall, retold in corners of the barracks, embellished, stripped, reshaped. Some said a SEAL had thrown a punch at a supply clerk. Others whispered he'd pulled rank. The truth was quieter but heavier. A SEAL had placed his rifle in the hands of a Marine everyone else had ignored. And that truth carried more weight than any fistfight ever could. Riley felt it before she heard it. The way Marines looked at her was different, hesitant but searching. No longer dismissive glances that skimmed past her like she wasn't there. Now their eyes lingered, as if trying to reconcile the woman with a mop and the medic who had crawled through fire. She wasn't sure which hurt more, being invisible before or being stared at now. She returned Chen's rifle after only an hour. Quietly, respectfully. She wasn't trying to hold on to it. She didn't need to. The gesture had already burned itself into her bones. She left it with a note written in her neat, unshaken handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me." But what Chen had given her wasn't just validation. It was responsibility. Because once you're seen, you can't hide anymore. The next morning, the whispers had grown louder. She walked through the corridors and caught fragments of conversation. "That's her, the one from Afghanistan. Did you hear what the SEAL said? 4 lives. Davis tore up her papers. Can you believe it?" She kept her eyes forward, jaw set. She didn't want to be gossip. She wanted to be useful. Still, something inside her was shifting. For months she had felt like a ghost, drifting through her duties, carrying memories that no one acknowledged. But now those memories were out in the open, pulled into the light for everyone to see. It terrified her. Because once people know, they expect something. By midweek, the event had reached leadership. Officers in pressed uniforms passed her in the hallway, nodding in acknowledgement. One even stopped to shake her hand. She accepted the gesture, but her heart was conflicted. Why now? Why not before? Why did it take a public humiliation, a SEAL's intervention, for them to remember who she was? The thought sat heavy. Respect earned in combat had been lost in silence and now resurrected only by spectacle. Was that truly respect, or just guilt? At night, alone in her quarters, she thought about it. The bunk was stiff, the walls bare, the hum of the bass constant. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the echoes of Afghanistan in her mind. The screams, the gunfire, the moments she had questioned whether she could keep going. And then she'd think of Chen's eyes when he handed her the rifle, calm, steady, as if he wasn't giving her something at all but returning what was already hers. It gave her a fragile thread of hope. Meanwhile, Davis had been quiet, too quiet. Rumors swirled that he'd been called in for questioning, that his behavior had been noted by higher-ups. Riley didn't revel in it. She didn't want revenge. She wanted change. But change in the military never came easy. 3 weeks later, she was summoned to an office she hadn't set foot in for months. The brass on the door gleamed with the name of a commanding officer she barely knew. She stepped inside, spine straight, expression calm. The officer gestured for her to sit. Papers lay on the desk, but they weren't requisition forms. They were transfer orders. "Corporal Montgomery," he said, his tone clipped but respectful. "We believe your experience is being wasted on facilities. You're being reassigned, training command. You'll be instructing new Marines in combat medicine and tactical resilience." The words hit her harder than any insult Davis had ever thrown. For a second, she couldn't breathe. Training command. Her knowledge, her scars, her lessons, they wanted her to pass them on. It wasn't pity, it wasn't charity, it was recognition. She nodded once, professional. "Understood, sir." But when she walked out of that office, her hands trembled, not with fear, with purpose. Because for the first time since Afghanistan, she felt she mattered again. Back in the armory, the culture had shifted too. The silence wasn't the same. Marines greeted her now, some clumsily, some with genuine respect. A few even apologized for the day they had stood still while she was humiliated. She accepted their words, but she never forgot. Silence leaves scars too. Chen visited once more before his unit shipped out. He didn't make a speech, didn't even mention the rifle. He just found her in the corridor, offered a firm nod, and said, "Make them better." 3 words, that was all, but Riley understood. Her new mission wasn't in Afghanistan anymore. It was here, training the next generation, teaching them that scars don't erase service, that dignity doesn't fade because of duty shifts, that silence is never neutral. And in that mission, she found a flicker of redemption. What's harder, surviving war, or teaching its lessons to those who haven't lived it? That was the question Riley asked herself as she stood in front of a classroom filled with fresh-faced recruits. The room smelled of marker ink and disinfectant, a sharp contrast to the dust and sweat she remembered from Afghanistan. Dozens of young Marines sat at long desks, notebooks open, pens ready. They looked at her with curiosity, some with doubt. She could see it in their eyes, the silent question. What could she possibly teach us? Riley's heart pounded. The last time she'd stood before a group, it had been in a medical tent under fire, her voice carrying over screams as she ordered tourniquets tightened and pressure applied. Back then, the urgency had been survival. Here, the urgency was different. These recruits didn't know what it meant to bleed for each other. Not yet. She took a breath, steadying herself. Her voice came low, controlled. You're here to learn combat medicine, not textbook medicine, not classroom answers. What I'll teach you is what keeps Marines alive when everything else fails. The room grew still. Even the doubtful eyes began to shift. Riley picked up a marker and drew a rough outline of a body on the whiteboard. Her hand didn't shake. She labeled arteries, wounds, pressure points. Then she stopped, letting the silence settle before she spoke again. I'm not going to pretend this is neat. It's not. Blood doesn't wait for clean gloves. Bullets don't care if you studied last night. And fear, her throat caught, but she pressed on, fear will try to make you freeze. You can't let it. The recruits scribbled notes, heads bent, but Riley could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They hadn't felt it. Not yet. And she wondered how much they could truly understand. Later that night, alone in her quarters, she replayed the day. The blank stares, the hesitant nods. Was she reaching them? Or was she just another instructor in their long line of training? The memories came back then, uninvited. The explosion, the screams, the smell of burning metal. She closed her eyes, trying to push it away, but it lingered. It always lingered. She pressed her palm against her shoulder, feeling the scar beneath her uniform. Sometimes she wondered if her students could see it, even when she tried to hide it. The next day, she changed her approach. Instead of diagrams, she told them a story. Not all of it, just enough. There was a convoy in Helmand. An IED took out the second vehicle. Marines down, enemy fire from the hills. I went back 3 times for the wounded. I shouldn't have made it back at all, but I did. Because I knew where to press, where to stop the bleeding, and because fear didn't get to win that day. The recruits were silent, not scribbling, not shifting, just listening. One raised his hand, voice uncertain. Ma'am, weren't you scared? Riley paused. The truth pressed against her chest like a weight. She could have lied, could have said no, that training carried her through, that courage canceled fear. But that wasn't the truth. Yes, she said softly. I was terrified, but fear doesn't mean you stop. Fear means you act anyway. Something in the room shifted. Respect, quiet and unspoken, began to grow. Over the weeks, Riley found her rhythm. She drilled them hard. Tourniquets in under 30 seconds, simulated pressure under fire. She made them drag each other across gravel, made them feel the strain in their muscles, the panic in their lungs. She wanted them to taste a fraction of what it felt like when seconds meant lives. But she also taught them something no manual covered: resilience. She told them about the nights after battle when sleep refused to come, about the invisible wounds that no metal healed, about carrying memories heavier than rucksacks. She never spoke of her Purple Heart directly, but the lessons dripped with its meaning. Some scars you'll see, she told them. Most you won't, but every Marine you serve with carries both. Remember that before you speak. Remember that before you judge. The recruits listened, some with wide eyes, some with furrowed brows. Riley knew not all of them understood yet. They couldn't. But someday, when the battlefield found them, maybe her words would return. Still, the burden of teaching wasn't easy. Each lesson peeled back her own memories. Each story reopened wounds she had tried to bury. Some nights she sat alone, hands shaking, wondering if she could keep doing it. But then she remembered the rifle Chen had placed in her hands. Make them better, he had said. That was her mission now. Weeks turned into months. Riley began to see changes in her recruits, confidence where there had been doubt, respect where there had been indifference. One day, after a brutal field exercise, a young Marine approached her quietly. "Ma'am, my father served in Iraq. He never talked about it, but the way you teach, I think I understand him a little better now." Riley felt her chest tighten. She nodded once, unable to speak. Because in that moment she realized something. Her scars weren't just reminders of what she had lost. They were bridges, bridges between her and those who would come after. And if she could build those bridges, then maybe, just maybe, the silence she had lived under for so long would finally mean something. How far can one moment echo? That was the question Riley found herself asking months after the armory incident. By now, the shock had faded, replaced by something quieter but deeper, respect that grew in whispers, not in spectacle. She had learned that real change didn't come in grand gestures. It came in slow, steady ripples. Her classroom had become a crucible. The recruits who once doubted her now carried themselves differently. They no longer rolled their eyes at combat medicine drills. They no longer asked why they needed to learn when real Marines fight. Instead, they moved with urgency, hands practiced, eyes sharp. Riley had made them believe that saving lives was as much a part of the fight as pulling a trigger. And then one day she saw proof. A recruit named Tors came running up to her after a field exercise, still covered in sweat and dirt. His voice shook with adrenaline as he told her how one of his squad mates had collapsed during the drill, heat, exhaustion hitting hard. "I remembered what you said, Corporal, about seconds mattering. I didn't freeze. I checked his airway, cooled him down, got him stable before the corpsman even arrived." Riley listened, her chest tightening, a wave of pride surging. Tors wasn't boasting. He was grateful. He had saved a life even in training, and he gave her credit for giving him the tools. She nodded, her voice calm. "You didn't need me out there. You had it in you all along. I just helped you see it." But when Tors walked away, Riley's throat burned. Because she knew what it meant. Her pain, her scars, her memories weren't wasted. They were being transformed into survival for the next generation. Word of her methods began to spread. Senior instructors noticed the intensity of her recruits, the way they approached every drill with focus others lacked. Officers began asking for her input, requesting she help shape the curriculum. It was subtle but undeniable. Riley was no longer invisible. Still, she carried doubt. Late at night, after long days of training, she sat alone in her quarters, the Purple Heart citation still folded in her pocket. She would take it out sometimes, smoothing the creases, reading the words she knew by heart. The paper reminded her of what she had done, but it also reminded her of what she had lost. She thought of the Marines she hadn't saved, the ones whose names she still remembered, whose faces still flashed in her dreams. She thought of the nights in Helmand when she wondered if she would ever make it home. And she wondered, did teaching erase any of that? Did making others stronger balance out the weight she carried? She didn't have the answer. But every morning she put on her uniform, walked into the classroom, and gave her recruits everything she had. One afternoon, during a training inspection, her commanding officer pulled her aside. His tone was businesslike, but his words surprised her. "Montgomery, I've had other instructors asking how you're getting through to these recruits. Whatever you're doing, it's working. They're sharper, more disciplined, more resilient." Riley nodded, unsure how to respond. Praise had always felt foreign to her. She had learned long ago that recognition was fleeting, fragile, but the officer wasn't done. "You're not just training Marines. You're changing culture, keep it up." The word struck her harder than she expected. Changing culture. She hadn't set out to do that. She just wanted to matter again. And yet slowly, without meaning to, she was reshaping the way people thought about strength, scars, and respect. It wasn't just the recruits either. Some of the same Marines who had been in the armory that day, the ones who had stayed silent, now treated her differently. Their greetings were steady, respectful. Some even sought her advice quietly, away from the crowd. One Marine, eyes downcast, finally admitted, "I should have spoken up that day. I didn't, and I regret it." Riley didn't lash out. She simply said, "Then don't stay silent the next time." The message was simple, but it stuck. She could see it in the way Marines started checking each other, calling out disrespect when they heard it. A small shift, but a shift nonetheless. And Davis. He was still on base, but changed. No longer cocky, no longer loud. He carried himself differently, quieter, as though the weight of that day still clung to him. Riley didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The silence that had once protected him now marked him. One evening, as she locked up her classroom, she saw him across the lot. Their eyes met. For a second, neither moved. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Montgomery, I was wrong." She didn't smile, didn't thank him. She just nodded once and walked on, because some apologies don't need words. Weeks turned into months. Riley's recruits began shipping out, heading to deployments she once would have joined. She watched them go with a strange mix of pride and ache. They carried pieces of her with them, her lessons, her warnings, her resilience. But she stayed behind, anchored by scars that would never let her leave again. At night, she sometimes thought of Marcus Chen. She hadn't seen him since his quiet farewell, but his words echoed, "Make them better." She wondered if he knew how far his gesture had reached, if he knew that by handing her his rifle, he had lit a fire that spread far beyond that armory. And she realized something. Respect wasn't about medals, it wasn't about rank, it wasn't about public gestures. Respect was about memory, about refusing to forget the battles carried inside the quietest Marines, about seeing dignity where others only saw duty. That was the culture she was building now, one recruit at a time. And though the nights were still long, though the memories still clawed at her when the base fell quiet, Riley felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hoping. What remains after the noise fades? That was the question Riley asked herself in the quiet hours, when the base had settled, when the barracks lights had dimmed, and when memories pressed hardest against her chest. The armory confrontation was months behind her, but its echo had not disappeared. Instead, it had grown quieter, deeper, like a ripple that kept moving outward long after the stone had been thrown. Sometimes she thought about how close she had come to breaking that day. One more insult, one more silence from the Marines around her, and she might have walked away with nothing but bitterness. But fate had put Marcus Chen in that room. A SEAL who had seen enough to know when silence cut deeper than shrapnel. A man who had chosen to act, not with fists or fury, but with a gesture that could never be erased. The rifle. She could still feel the weight of it in her hands, heavy with memory, heavy with meaning. She had only held it for an hour, but it had been enough to remind her of something she had almost forgotten. She was still a warrior. Now, standing before rows of recruits, she carried that memory with her. They looked at her not with doubt anymore, but with respect, some even with admiration. But Riley never let it go to her head. She didn't want to be a hero. She didn't want to be a legend whispered about in the chow hall. She wanted to be useful. That was enough. Her lessons had started to spread beyond the classroom. Recruits wrote letters home, telling families about the instructor who had taught them not only how to save lives, but how to respect the unseen battles their brothers and sisters might be fighting. Officers began repeating her words in briefings. Fear doesn't mean you stop. Fear means you act anyway. Her voice had begun to weave itself into the culture of the base, even if most didn't realize where it came from. And that was fine with her. She didn't need her name on a wall. She didn't need speeches or ceremonies. She had seen what real recognition looked like. A Marine pulled from the dust and carried home alive. Everything else was decoration. Still, she carried the folded Purple Heart citation in her pocket, not for others, for herself. On the hardest days, when the memories returned sharp and unforgiving, she would touch the paper and remind herself it had happened, that the battlefield hadn't been a dream, that the scars meant something. Sometimes she would sit alone and think of the 4 Marines she had dragged through fire. She wondered what they were doing now, if they were home, if they thought of her. She never reached out. She didn't need to. Knowing they were alive was enough. One evening, after another long day of drills, Riley sat outside the barracks under the fading light. The sky was streaked with orange and gold, the hum of the bass steady in the background. A group of recruits jogged past, their laughter light, unburdened. She watched them go, pride mixing with something more complicated. She knew some of them would face battles like hers. Some would return with scars seen and unseen. Some wouldn't return at all. The thought ached, but it also steeled her, because every lesson she gave them now, every story, every drill, every moment of honesty was a seed planted, a chance to prepare them for the weight she knew was coming. And maybe, if even one of them remembered her words when it mattered most, then her journey wasn't in vain. She leaned back against the bench, closing her eyes. For so long she had felt invisible. For so long she had carried the burden alone. But now she understood something she hadn't before. Dignity wasn't about medals. It wasn't about promotions or recognition. It wasn't even about who carried a rifle and who carried a mop. Dignity was quieter, stronger. It was the choice to stand tall when others tried to push you down. It was the patience to endure silence until someone finally broke it. It was the courage to act, or sometimes, simply to endure. Her thoughts drifted back to that day in the armory, the sting of Davis's words, the silence of the room, and then Chen's hand offering her his rifle without hesitation. One act, one choice. It had changed everything. Not just for her, but for the Marines who watched, for the recruits she now trained, for the culture of respect that had begun to take root. She opened her eyes, the sunset fading into deep blue. The night would come as it always did. The memories would return as they always did, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Because she knew who she was. A Marine, a teacher, a survivor. And as the first stars appeared overhead, Riley whispered the truth she had carried all along, a truth she hoped every recruit would one day understand. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.